Hello, and a very warm welcome to National Book Festival Presents, brought to you by the Library of Congress. My name is Marie Arana, and I'm the Literary Director at the Library of Congress. And now that we're here on the verge of Gay Pride Month, June 2020, we'd like to mark the 50th anniversary of the first celebration of this landmark moment in American history. We're very fortunate to have with us today Eric Cervini, who is a distinguished and accomplished scholar who has done his research actually at the Library of Congress. And it's a special thrill to see somebody through the process of writing a book and publishing a book and then bringing it to us in a broadcast moment like this. So we want to welcome Eric. His book is called The Deviant War, The Homosexual versus the United States of America. And interviewing him today is Roswell Encina, my very talented colleague, who's a former journalist, but is now the Chief of Communications at the Library of Congress. Roswell, over to you.
Well, thank you, Marie, and good to see you, Eric. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride. Thank you so much for having me.
And congratulations on this book. I should say it's a very hefty book. As Marie mentioned, you did your research here at the library, and thank you for sending me an advance copy. It was truly a wonderful thing to be reading the past couple of weeks. I was able to be educated myself by everything that's in that book, and we are very excited that you did, of course, all your research at the Library of Congress.
Oh, well, thank you so much for making this book possible. And I should assure viewers that a big chunk of the book are endnotes. So, and a big portion of those endnotes come from the Library of Congress. So I truly couldn't have done all of that research without all of y'all's hard work.
And of course, that's music to our ears. Now, as Marie mentioned, this year we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of Pride in this country. It happened in 1970, a year after the Stonewall riots of 1969. So I know we have a lot to talk to here in our very limited time. So the title of the book is The Deviant War. Who are you referring to as the deviant?
So you would assume that it's primarily Frank Kameny, and it is. I mean, the book is told through the eyes of the grandfather of the modern gay rights movement. And, you know, I chose a word that was ambiguous because even though he is a deviant as classified by the United States federal government, which was purging alleged homosexuals from its ranks during the McCarthy era, and they would use that word taken from psychiatrists. But, you know, the book is telling a larger story about America in the 1960s, and especially the homophile movement, as the pre-Stonewall gay rights movement was called. And we're using Frank and his eyes and experiences as a lens to really understand a larger phenomenon of not just him as a white gay guy creating change, but also other deviants throughout the entire country who were influencing him and also were influenced by him, whether they were trans activists, lesbian activists, people within the Black freedom movement. So I certainly use the term deviant as a broad tent.
Now, there's some statistics here that are quite alarming that I think many people are unaware this was happening in the US in the mid-20th century. You write in your book, after World War II, homosexual arrests, including those for sodomy, dancing, kissing, or holding hands, occurred at the rate of 1 every 10 minutes, each hour, every day for 15 years. In some, 1 million citizens found themselves persecuted by the American state for sexual deviation. Your book does portray a nice landscape, I won't say nice, but a good description of gay life in the United States in the 50s and 60s. And as you mentioned, you were talking about Frank Kameny. There were a lot of men and women before Stonewall that came before that riot and did their part for LGBTQ rights. Who is Frank Kameny?
Well, Frank Kameny was first and foremost an astrophysicist. He was a PhD graduate from Harvard University, studying in their phenomenal astronomy program, and was becoming an astronomer at the very launch of the space race. He started his government job as an astronomer within weeks of the launch of Sputnik. So you could not have chosen a better profession within the sciences in a better time. But unfortunately, the government found out that he was gay. And so he became one of the victims of the gay purges, or what other historians call the Lavender Scare. And he essentially was the first to fight back, taking his case against the government to the Supreme Court. And when that didn't work, he kept fighting as he would for the rest of his life, and essentially constructed what we now know as gay pride.
You mentioned, the landscape. Then, if the federal government or your employer found out you were gay, or even just suspected of being gay, you'd be fired or laid off. I mean, it's kind of obscenely. If people look back of the reasoning that why they were doing this, they were assuming that if you were gay, you could either easily be blackmailed, or they could assume that you were a Russian spy even. Where did that thinking come from? And I know there's, in your book, you even list the 13 reasons that the CIA mentioned why you can't trust a homosexual in the federal government.
Yeah. 13 reasons why governments homosexuals should not be in the government. So, that logic of persecution, I think, is really understudied in understanding. We all know that homosexuals and sexual deviants were persecuted because they were disgusting to those in power, and they were also useful to those in power. And you see at the exact same time that Joseph McCarthy begins his crusade against alleged communists in the government, well, of course, those claims are very flimsy. So what does he do? He looks for a way to bolster his numbers, his ever-shifting numbers of how many security risks there are in the government. And one of the ways that he and his allies do that are by saying, well, it's not just actual communists or those who are fellow travelers who are security risks. We have a whole nother group of security risks who are sexually deviant and are necessarily secretive about their sex life, their second life, and therefore they're susceptible to blackmail by communist agents. So that reasoning allowed, that national security rationale allowed the gay purges to continue for decades. And so that is what Kameny really was up against, and having to debunk and disprove that rationale and show that it was unconstitutional, arbitrary, and rooted in prejudice.
Set the scene for us. I mean, the federal government and the Metropolitan Police here in DC, and maybe police departments across the nation, were going through big lengths pretty much of just trying to arrest both gay and lesbian citizens of this country, like staking out at parks, or here in DC, it was at Lafayette Park, which is the park across the White House right now. Could you explain that for folks who don't understand what was going on at that time?
Well, you have to remember that in almost every single state, homosexual activity, especially sodomy, was illegal at the time. And even if sodomy itself wasn't the charge against sexual deviance, then there was public indecency or loitering or vagrancy often. And so there really was a regime of police departments working in tandem with the FBI, working in tandem with the Civil Service Commission, where, they're in all public spaces, in public parks, public restrooms, train terminals. Most cities had a morals division or a vice squad, and those police officers were specifically assigned wearing tight-fitting clothes, usually young, good-looking men, standing at urinals in restrooms, or in Frank Kamey's case, literally hidden in the ceiling above him, watching through a ventilation grill, simply there to catch alleged homosexuals. And that essentially created a second-class citizenry within the United States, because once you were arrested, that followed you for the rest of your life.
When did it click for Frank Kameny? I know he didn't really seek out to be, an activist here. He was an astronomer. He went to Harvard. Then he got fired. What made him click to realize, I've got to do something?
I think for the people who knew him, he was a very eccentric man. He had he was very passionate about what he believed was right, and he would always say that I know what is right, and if society disagrees, then I will continue fighting for what I know is right, and society will eventually catch up with me. And so that was rooted really in him being such a devoted follower of logic. And, he was trained as an astronomer at studying astrophysics. He believed in what was logical and rational. And for him, at the beginning of his experience when the government found out about his gay arrest, when it removed him from the service, it was a matter of him disproving the reasoning of the government. So when they would say, you're a homosexual, therefore you're a security risk, he would say, well, how am I a security risk if the entire world knows that I'm gay? Or if you want to claim that I'm morally bad, I know as a scientist, as an atheist, that is arbitrary and illogical. So I'm going to prove that fact by making my own arbitrary claim, which was to be gay, homosexual activity was morally good. And that is what I argue is one of the first iterations of what we now celebrate each year, each June, as Pride.
He had the big responsibility of explaining that homosexuals were, just not folks that went into parks, but, were average people who worked in the government. I think the two big things that he wanted to stress that was he distinguished respectable homosexuals, and he wanted to make sure that people knew that homosexuals were not sick. And why were those two sticking points very important to him?
Well, respectability is a big theme that runs throughout the book because, 5 years before Stonewall, gay organizations, these homophile activists, were marching, and they did so dressed very much like we're dressed now in suits and ties, and women wore dresses and high heels. And they did so to make a point, as Frank would say, if you want to be employed by the government, you should look employable. And for him, it was just a very concrete strategy of, we just want to be like any other straight federal employee who doesn't have to live in fear about their life being ruined. And so that's where the respectability came from. But eventually, as the 60s progressed, and as you have a new generation of activists, especially after Stonewall, who said, that's self-defeating. If you're just trying to fit in and assimilate, even if it's for strategic reasons, then what's the point? What is even the point of fighting? And so that's the conflict you start to see, and it unravels through the book. And as for the medical side of things, very similar to the national security rationale. The reason that the government was able to say that gays and other sexual deviants shouldn't be allowed in the government was because they were mentally unstable, right? So there's yet another layer to their reasoning, where part of why gays were susceptible to blackmail was because they were psychiatric or psychologically unstable, right? Or untrustworthy. And so you see all these different, reasons for why the government is looking for ways of persecution.
Now, Frank was the leader for the most part of the Machine of Washington Association here in DC, and there were a couple other several organizations popping up all across the East Coast and on the West Coast. But there was a time that they were really not getting along. Why was that the case? Is it because everybody wanted to approach it differently? And, Frank was very, strict about it. As you mentioned, he wanted people in suits and ties while they were picketing, but not everybody saw it that way.
Exactly. And it really was a regional difference as well, especially that divide within the homophile movement prior to Stonewall and even after was along the lines of West Coast versus East Coast. And what you see in the West Coast, which was very important, and you see in the numbers of how large these organizations were, the Mattachine Society of Washington only got a few dozen members at its peak. But then you have organizations like SIR in San Francisco, that have thousands of members, because they say, well, it's not just about lobbying or just about lawsuits or just about, really dignified demonstrations. It's also about providing community, providing social events. And then once we provide that community, we can use those numbers to attain political power. And so you see these two different philosophies, and there are pros and cons of each. And I think Frank eventually saw the benefits of having sheer magnitude, sheer numbers. And you see that in 1970 at the very first Pride celebration.
And Frank was very busy, I should say, and he struggled financially because he couldn't find a full-time job because of what happened. But aside from being the head of the machine of Washington, he was also taking and helping other federal employees who were fired or let go from their jobs. And he was acting like a lawyer, even though he wasn't trained as a lawyer. Why do you think it was very important for him to be representing other federal employees who were let go?
Well, you have to remember at the time, the American Civil Liberties Union, beginning in, as soon as they had their first case of someone coming to them saying, I have been fired from my job for being gay, will you take my case? They would say no. And they had a strict policy saying, we will not help gays or security risks fight the government. And Frank was really the first one to persuade the Washington chapter of the ACLU to start taking these cases. But one of the ways he was able to do that was by handling the administrative side, because you can't really take a case to court unless you've exhausted all of your administrative possibilities of fighting it. So appealing it to the highest levels of the Pentagon, of the Security Clearance Office, and rather than waiting for someone who was a trained attorney to take these cases, and whether they had time or the bandwidth to actually fight them within the federal bureaucracy, which, as you find out from the book, is very Kafkaesque. He was the one to do this and lay the foundations for the attorneys to then take into the courts. And it was really, really impressive to see how he was able to infuse some of his legal argumentation with some of the more personal publicity style strategy of having some of his plaintiffs, I call them the proud plaintiff, that is his invention, convincing them to publicly declare their homosexuality, going to having press conferences in the hallways of the Pentagon. That was just completely unheard of. And for Frank, it was solely to disprove the rationale of the purges, because if you have a gay man or woman standing before the Associated Press and other outlets declaring their homosexuality, how could a communist ever blackmail them? And so that also helped develop and expand his idea of homosexuality being a moral good that eventually caught on.
So Frank is right in the middle of American history right now. There's two big names that pop up in your book that people will recognize immediately: J. Edgar Hoover, and the other one is President Johnson's senior advisor, Walter Jenkins. We'll get to J. Edgar Hoover here shortly. Who is Walter Jenkins, and what happened to him? And this really kind of put, I should say, Mr. Jenkins' experience, the gay rights position really in the forefront.
Right. And a lot of people know or might have heard about his story. And Walter Jenkins was really President Johnson's right-hand man. Ever since meeting him in Texas, he'd been with him for decades. And was, there's a quote from, someone in the Washington Post saying, Walter Jenkins knew more or had more access to classified material than anyone in the White House. And one night, days before the 1964 election, he was arrested for homosexual activity in the basement restroom of the YMCA. And so then the question arises, if you have someone who has access to all the classified material available to the president, who is arrested for homosexual activity, does that mean that he was susceptible to blackmail? Was he a security risk. But the problem with that was that J. Edgar Hoover, if he were to grant that as a fact, then that would have meant that he and his bureau had failed. And so it put the government, including LBJ, including the FBI and the Secret Service, into a very awkward position where they had to eventually declare, well, yes, he may have been, susceptible to these homosexual activities, but he wasn't a security risk. He was okay. And so people like Frank Kameny and even the Washington area ACLU, they leap upon that and say, well, if he's not susceptible to blackmail, then why are you still claiming that all these other people who are openly gay and who have less to hide are susceptible to blackmail? So just further debunking parts of the rationale that the government kept using to justify its persecution.
So your book does a great job of going through the 50s and the 60s and maybe the very small baby steps that they were able to do of doing marches and picket lines from California to DC to Philadelphia to New York. But it kind of all changed overnight after the riots at Stonewall. How was that the tipping point that changed everything?
Yeah, and I love that you said changed everything, because what I tell to everyone is Stonewall didn't start everything, but it changed everything. And really, like we talked about earlier, it was a matter of numbers. So you had these organizations that were organizing, maybe a few more than a dozen organizations across the country were organizing in the early 60s, and those numbers grew slightly. But then you have this moment of violent resistance in June 1969 that actually gets media coverage, and suddenly a new generation of activists who had already been very active in women's liberation, in the anti-war movement, suddenly seeing, oh, this is another outlet for us to start fighting for structural revolutionary change. And so you see the rise of new groups like the Gay Liberation Front, and then after that, the Gay Activists Alliance in New York, and you start to see a bit of a struggle of not just power, but also philosophy with organizations like the Mattachine Society of Washington and individuals who previously had been able to really get their way through, just sheer force of personality, like Frank Kameny, and suddenly that's not enough anymore. And you see big changes within the movement, and but a lot of the rhetoric, you hear "gay is good" constantly after Stonewall, but Frank Kameny and other activists had already been using that phrase. So it was a big change, but those changes were possible because of people like Frank.
Now, finally, in 1975, Frank finally got some good news. Let me just read something from your book. On July 3, 1975, the General Counsel of the CSC called Frank Kameny with the news. Later that day, the CSC would announce that homosexual conduct no longer disqualified American citizens from federal employment. That took almost 30 years till Frank got fired from his job. Then I have to leapfrog a little bit more when President Clinton signed Executive Order 12968, and finally it all culminated when President Obama signed into law as well. I would like you to sign, read this letter that was given to Frank Kameny almost 50 years from the time he started his ordeal, I should say, of trying to get his job back.
Sure. And this was in June 2009. He got a letter saying, "Dear Dr. Kameny, in what we know today was a shameful action, the United States Civil Service Commission in 1957 upheld your dismissal from your job solely on the basis of your sexual orientation. With the fervent passion of a true patriot, you did not resign yourself to your fate or quietly endure this wrong. With courage and strength, you fought back. Please accept our apology for the consequences of the previous policy of the United States government."
How do you think Frank felt at that moment?
Well, the next line, for the people who were there, sadly, I never had the chance to meet Frank, but a lot of people were in that room, and Frank stood up and said very simply, he was usually not a man of few words, but in this case, he just said, "Apology accepted."
I do have some questions that we gathered through the library's social media. So let me just ask a couple. I got a question from the Senate Glass Caucus, which is an association of LGBTQ Hill staffers who work in the Senate. Their question is, as out LGBTQ Capitol Hill staffers, how can we continue the legacy of gay rights activism from the 50s and 60s while persuading folks with various political, social, and religious beliefs?
I think that's a great question. And I think it is investigating and exposing and fighting against policies that currently exist that continue. So even though, President Obama ended Don't Ask, Don't Tell, a lot of people think the fight is over, but trans Americans currently can't serve in the military. 28 states have no comprehensive protections for sexual orientation or gender identity. There is currently a war against trans children by the Republican Party in states across the country. And the fight that Frank Kameny and others started continues. And I think a big thing that we should remember this Pride season, this month, is that Pride is synonymous with resistance. And the very first Pride March, exactly 50 years ago, marchers were terrified of marching. And they thought, they were advised not to wear glasses or necklaces because they were worried about getting strangled or harassed by the police. And they marched and they were resisting very, very explicitly the policies of New York City, New York State, and the federal government. So I think we need to bring that spirit of resistance back, especially now when the parades are canceled and people are looking for ways to still celebrate. I think it's do your research, find where persecution continues today, find which organizations, just like Frank Kameny's organization, are still fighting, are still filing the lawsuits. The ACLU is still filing suits in Idaho. The Sylvia Rivera Law Project is still protecting trans immigrants who are being persecuted right now during this pandemic. So I think finding those organizations that are doing the work and supporting them, that's how you can make that change. And you can do that as a federal worker. You can do that as someone who's unemployed. You can find out, ask the questions, how can we help?
Now, Teddy from Bowie, Maryland asks, what do historians need to do differently to recognize the contributions of people other than white gay men and the recounting of the homophile and early gay liberation movement? He also says, I know there are only a handful of women remembered like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. Do you think some of the other activists are forgotten or even minimized when we look back?
Yes, 100%. And I think it is the moral obligation of not just historians, but anyone who identifies as a cis white gay man or any one of those things to be doing that research, because it's easier to erase people. As a historian going into an archive, going into Frank's papers, for example, yes, he did a lot of amazing work, but he was privileged enough to keep a lot of those materials. He had somewhere to put them. Sylvia Rivera, slipping in and out of homelessness throughout her life, had nowhere to keep all the records of her activism throughout her entire life. So it's much harder for historians to tell her story, but we still have the obligation to do that extra work. And there are ways of telling the story. So even though this book is told largely through Frank's eyes, you can still make the connections as a historian and do the work of saying, all right, let's see, where does Sylvia Rivera's name come up in other contexts? And then you see, actually, Sylvia was responsible for rejuvenating the legal action committee of the Gay Activists Alliance single-handedly. She was the one who, and that is, we have the receipts. We have the archival documents in the New York Public Library saying, because of Sylvia, we have reestablished the legal committee. That legal committee became Lambda Legal. Lambda Legal was the first organization to fight in Hawaii for gay marriage. So we have gay marriage literally because of Sylvia Rivera. And so those kinds of lines, even though they're difficult to find, you have to go through the papers and literally search for her name. We have that obligation to do that work.
We were talking about J. Edgar Hoover earlier. Now, as we were talking about, even the Metropolitan Police will actually have to call the FBI and report if they arrested someone or was taking anyone in. So I have a question from Erickson of Washington, D.C. He says, you mentioned J. Edgar Hoover a lot in your book. During the course of your research, what did you find out about Hoover's sexuality and his right-hand man?
So I defer to other scholars on their evaluations of his sexuality, and I keep my hands off from that. But I will say this: he was obsessive about protecting his image more than anyone I've ever researched, and combating any instance of the press or even individuals of organizations questioning his sexuality. And there's an 1,000-page plus FBI file on the Mattachine Society alone. And remember, the Mattachine Society had a few dozen members in the 60s. So the fact that there was this personal, obsessive, vindictive focus on this organization that was claiming, because at the time these rumors were existent, right? They were already well aware of, this wasn't after the fact historians saying maybe he was gay. People at the time were making these innuendos. So the fact that he was so obsessive, I think, is more important than whether he was or was not actually gay. I think seeing how actually invested he was in maintaining this regime of surveillance and blackmail, essentially, because he would be blackmailing anyone who was allegedly gay in order to get more power for himself and more information, because, of course, information is power.
Well, Lee, I'll end it with one question that's close to home from LC Globe. It's the Staff Association of LGBTQ Staff Members of the Library of Congress. Their question is, your book introduces us to a man activist named Otto Ulrich, who, as it turns out, worked at the Library of Congress. Can you tell us a little bit more about Otto from your research and his role in the U.S. homophile movement? I believe he was part of the first march, right, outside the White House.
Yes, he was one of the first 10 outside of the White House, and he was one of the first proud plaintiffs, plaintiffs who were willing to sue the federal government because of the gay purges. He was a victim himself of it. And what's so amazing about him is he had so much to lose. He knew something like 6 languages. He had a very high level position, but he was willing to take to the government to court. And he, along with a couple other plaintiffs like Benning Wentworth, actually won. They were really the first case, with the help of the ACLU, to win at the district court level. And so he really demonstrated to the entire country and to other attorneys that there was a legal path to success in fighting the gay purges. And very quickly, you start to see, because of Otto, other ACLU chapters advising their attorneys to say, okay, if you have a case like this, you should tell your plaintiff to come out of the closet. And so this fusion of legal strategy and sexual identity and political power, I think, is so important. And I think it's important today, now more than ever.
We'll have to leave it at that. We could talk here all night long, Eric, about your book and the history of LGBTQ rights here in this country. But I encourage everyone to grab his book. It comes out next week, The Deviant War. And we want to thank Eric Cervini, and happy Pride.
Happy Pride. Thanks so much for having me.
Take care.